Well, hey, welcome to this podcast. We're talking about thinking biblically, right? We've been through thinking critically. We've looked at thinking historically, and now we want to take a look at thinking biblically. And as we launch off into this lesson, there's a couple things. One, this lesson is one of my favorite to talk about with my students in class in the regular school year. First, because it usually brings great dialogue, and it usually, as you'll see by the end of it, kind of causes some students to go, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. And as a teacher, those are some of the things that I really enjoy most. When I see those light bulbs go on, when I see worldviews being challenged and things like that, and there's great discussion that happens with that, man, that is what I live for as a teacher. So we're going to jump into this. And I want you to think back to a time. You can see there that there is Santa Claus, and that's my daughter, her first Christmas. And, you know, it seemed like the first probably 7 years of her life that my wife and I portrayed this Santa Claus experiment, this farce each and every Christmas, right? We would have not only the visit with Santa Claus at the mall, but we'd have, Santa come Christmas Eve while she was sleeping. And we would even put like chewed up carrots outside for like what the reindeer had supposedly eaten. And of course there'd be some bites out of the cookies left and stuff. And I think it was probably around 7 years old, maybe 8 years old. My daughter decided to go, hey, wait a minute. Is this actually for real? Or is this just like some great production from mom and dad? And, even though she came to the conclusion that Santa wasn't real, she actually still enjoys us kind of keeping the tradition and the farce alive. So I tell you that to kind of set the tone for where we're going with this. And how do we verify whether or not something is authentic? Many of you probably had a similar experience as my daughter. And I will confess, like there was a time in my life where for me, absolutely, I believed in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. Some of you probably could even say like you believed in those and maybe Star Wars characters or Marvel characters or Disney princesses or any one of a number of these like fictionalized characters that are part of our culture and part of kind of growing up. And so inevitably we all come to a point where we say, oh, wait a minute, maybe my understanding of that isn't what my understanding of that should be. And that's really going to kind of be the crux and the foundation of where this particular lesson goes. There is some things that you're going to do along the way. You're going to fill out some a set of notes as I go through this. And as we do that, as you do that, I want you to keep kind of processing this story about Santa Claus or Disney princesses or the Tooth Fairy, whatever it is where you had that epiphany that maybe things weren't quite as you understood them to be. So with that, we're going to also take a look at some really important foundational concepts. And let me just kind of touch on each of these. And then with that, we'll really jump into this. This first thing that I want to jump into is intellectual integrity. And inevitably, if I ask my class during a normal school year, hey, how would you define integrity? Inevitably, there's a student that comes up with an answer that goes something like this. Now, integrity is doing the right thing even when it's difficult to do. Or integrity is doing the right thing even when no one would know the difference. And I think that that's a really good definition of integrity, right? It's doing what's right. And so if we take this and look at it at intellectual integrity, it's the same principle behind it, but it's saying like, oh, based on the new evidence that I have, I now have to kind of adjust how I think about things intellectually, right? There's also this word called ignorance. And ignorance can sometimes be confused with being called stupid. And that's the farthest thing from the truth. So if you've ever made the mistake that I have, and you've confused those two words and thought ignorance and stupidity were synonymous, they're absolutely not. And here's what's great about ignorance. Ignorance is a temporary state. Ignorance is simply not knowing the fullness of the truth, which is great because whether it's Disney princesses or Santa Claus or something much more important and relevant in our daily lives, ignorance is just that temporary spot. And once we become enlightened, once we're shown the truth, then we have the choice, because of intellectual integrity, then we have the choice to no longer be ignorant, right? If we choose to be ignorant, after we're shown the truth, then that's no longer ignorance. Then that does kind of drift down the path towards just being intellectually disingenuous or having no intellectual integrity. This next word, oh my goodness. If there was like one thing, if I had a magic wand as a teacher, this would be like the one thing that I would really want our current generation of students and learners to understand, that apathy, just kind of having a attitude about stuff, is probably one of the most dangerous mindsets in the world today. Like, ignorance can be cured, right? We can show you the truth, but apathy, just not really caring about anything, boy, that's dangerous. That's dangerous. That if we're apathetic in our own lives when it comes to like career goals, then we're probably not going to reach those career goals. But on a much more important scale, if we have apathy with things like, I don't really want to go find out if this is a valid source. I'm just going to believe whatever I see on my feed on TikTok or Twitter or Reddit or Instagram or whatever. I don't know if it's accurate, but it's on here, so I'm just going to assume it's accurate. That is such a scary and dangerous place to be. So please, if you take nothing else from this entire course, please don't be apathetic in life. Please don't be apathetic in life. Get out there. Be motivated. Have intrinsic, inward motivation to learn truth and then to act upon that. And then this last one that I want to touch on before we dive into this is this concept of like science versus faith, and somehow this false understanding that the two can't coincide with one another, that they have to be two very different siloed things. And that just isn't the truth. I want you to understand that science, which attempts to explain things through methods and strategies, can very much live in the same world as faith, that they are not diametrically opposed to one another, that faith can very much embrace science, and science can very much embrace faith, that they don't have to be either I'm a person of faith or I'm a person of science. Now, I want you to do your best to really get rid of that mindset, and I'm going to do my best during this particular lesson to really show you how those two things can coexist and maybe even work together in a lot of instances. With that being said, I'm going to show you a video, and the video is going to talk about that intellectual integrity. It's also going to talk about this thing called intellectual humility, which is just being able to go like, oh, maybe I need to expand how I'm looking at things, how I'm thinking about things. Maybe I've been thinking incorrectly about something, right? So let me play that video. That video is going to kind of act as our final foundational piece as we spring forward and continue the lesson from there. So here's the video about intellectual humility.
We've all been in arguments. And it wouldn't be an argument if you didn't believe that you were right and they were wrong. But aren't we all wrong sometimes? No one is right about all the things all the time. Research shows that admitting that we might be wrong can actually help us be better friends, happier people, and more effective advocates for our beliefs. This is called intellectual humility, and it's a gift. Not the kind you're born with, but the kind you can give yourself. So why don't we? Why is it so hard to admit that we might be wrong? In our minds, our ideas, assumptions, and experiences weave together to form our picture of the world. So you can see why it's painful to admit that something we believe in is wrong. One tug on the thread and it can feel like our whole sense of self is unraveling. In fact, studies show that our brains actually react to attacks on our beliefs the same way as threats to our physical well-being. Our natural human tendency is to avoid those threats. Surround ourselves with people who think just like us. It doesn't matter how smart or well-educated you are. Anyone can fall into these traps. But we can break out of these bubbles. Our ideas don't need to limit us. We just need to remember that some of the things we know are wrong or incomplete. It doesn't have to feel like a failure. It can feel like a relief. We can let go of the ideas that were holding us back from growth. This is one of the key features of intellectual humility, that willingness to accept and admit that you might be wrong. Early research shows that people who practice intellectual humility make more thoughtful decisions, have stronger connections with their friends and partners, and are more tolerant, which could lead to a happier life. We live in a time where there's pressure to appear like you're always right. But recognizing an incompleteness in our knowledge isn't weakness or ignorance. It's the opposite. It turns every day into an opportunity to learn and grow. In fact, people who practice intellectual humility are shown to be better at recognizing persuasive arguments. That means you could be a more effective advocate for your beliefs by allowing them to be challenged. The scientific method asks us to test every idea, question every theory, and that discipline is responsible for much of the explosive progress that has defined the last 2 centuries. Intellectual humility is the same principle applied to the individual, constantly refining your understanding of the world and yourself. The person you are now only exists because the person you were was willing to grow into something new. Intellectual humility is that willingness. It allows us to constantly search through our understanding of the world and bit by bit, make it better. Learn more about research on intellectual humility at templeton.org/discoveries.
All right, so that video did a great job of really presenting this idea of really pushing back against some of our own ideals, to not just be so dug into our ideals and our concepts that we're forsaking the ability to actually grow and to learn and to become better humans as we do both of those things. So intellectual humility is this ability to go, I don't have all the answers. And it might even be so crazy as to be something. So I was like, oh, actually, my understanding of something was wrong. And I know that can be very difficult given today's culture and our tribalism and the division between political ideals and all those things. But intellectual humility is something that I think is so beautiful. The ability to go like, oh, I need to learn more about that. Oh, my concept or understanding of something wasn't as full as I thought it was. Or maybe even to the extreme, once again, like, oh, I actually was wrong about that. So that is this beauty of being intellectually humble, having intellectual humility. In addition to that, again, why is it so important to think in those terms? Well, I believe it has to do with the fact that we are all human, right? None of us is perfect. Jesus was the perfect one. He gets that title alone. For us, we should constantly be growing and adjusting our worldviews, our understanding of life. And that could be even if you grow up as what I'll loosely call someone who is a churched family, right? You grow up going to youth group. You identify as Christian from day one. That's all you ever know. Even then, we need not fool ourselves to believe that we know everything about everything when it comes to our faith and our understanding and interpretation of Scripture and all those things. So it's important for us as humans to be humble, right? And just think of how many biblical verses there are about being humble. Think about how Jesus himself portrayed being humble, right? And so that's why it's really important for us, especially if we identify as Christians, to remain intellectually humble so that we can grow, so that we're not locked into these childlike understandings of things, so that we can actually hold our conversation with even the most brilliant of scientific minds or other intellectual minds, right? So let's continue on and let's kind of dive down into some of the finer points about this lesson. So here's our inquiry statement. This is where we're going to begin. And let me go ahead and read it for you. An accurate understanding of the scientific method, right? You use that scientific method probably sometime in like 6th or 7th grade science class where you came up with a hypothesis and then you tested that hypothesis. And then based on whether your testing was right or wrong, it kind of answered your scientific method. So an accurate understanding of that scientific method used to determine the accuracy of a historical document. Notice I'm just saying any historical document. I'm not talking just simply about Scripture. An accurate understanding of the scientific method used to determine the accuracy of a historical document is vital to our understanding of history itself. Let me just say that in everyday terms. If we don't use the same trusted methods time and time again to determine whether a historical document is accurate or not, our view, our perception, our understanding of historical events in the past can be completely warped, right? Like if we were just to rely on tweets or TikTok videos or Instagram stories for our understanding of history and political events and all those similar things, we're going to find ourselves in trouble fairly quickly. However, if we understand the scientific method that's involved, if we understand that we're shooting for accuracy every single time, and then we can take those examples from history and understand it through that lens, then we have a much better chance at actually understanding the fullness of what went down in history. And again, that goes back to those things we talked about earlier too, about getting rid of apathy, about being intellectually humble, about all those things that go to this well-rounded understanding of not only who we are, but where we've been, and then obviously where we're going. So that's our inquiry statement. As we go forward, though, I want to ask some questions. Here's kind of like just a low-level question, right? If we were kind of building a pyramid, this would be at the very bottom of it. So here's our factual question. How are historical documents deemed to be accurate representations of historical events? So if Indiana Jones goes into the jungle and finds a cave, and in that cave he finds that scroll and brings that scroll back to the university, how are those documents that Indiana Jones gets out of that cave deemed to be actual accurate representations of history? How do we know? Just because it's old doesn't mean it's accurate. So how do we know that it is accurate because it's old? So that's one of the questions we're going to work towards answering in this particular lesson. And then we also want to take a look at this conceptual question. So now we've moved from this kind of very basic question. Now we're kind of moving to more of like a Google Earth satellite view of things. We're looking for more of a macro understanding. And so our level 2 question is, how does the accuracy of Scripture compare to other non-religious historical documents? So if we were going to take the Bible, right, and we were going to take all these other historical documents, right, like dating back to Roman or even pre-Roman times, right, how do we take both of those? And how does the Bible stack up against those other documents that we have deemed as historically accurate? And when I say we, I mean leading universities and minds throughout history and throughout the world, not just the dude whose voice you're listening to right now. So that's our level 2 conceptual question, that kind of that macro Google Earth view. So it seems like a very long time ago, and it was, in fact. I used to work in a law firm as a law clerk. And my job, or one of my jobs, I should say, was when we were getting ready to go to trial, my job was to interview witnesses and compile and gather all the evidence and then put it kind of in one big pack. And so I could hand it off to the attorneys in the firm and say, here it is. Here's all evidence. Here are the photographs. Here are the witness testimonies. Here are all the video footage. Here, whatever we had. And we would take that and then we would bring that evidence to either before a judge or a jury. And when we're dealing in civil crimes in the United States anyway, what we're looking for is a way to determine that a defendant, or in the case of a civil case, a respondent, would be guilty. How do we figure out if someone has done somebody else wrong? Well, in the United States, we have this thing called a preponderance of evidence. And what this simply means is it requires a majority of convincing and material evidence against a defendant. Now, that's different than we might see on like a police show where it's talking about criminal law, right? And it's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And a lot of the stuff we talk about can certainly fit into that category, but for the purposes of this scientific method that universities around the world use to deem the historical accuracy of Scripture, this is what we're going with, a preponderance of the evidence. A majority, 51% or more, a majority of convincing, right? It's got to be authentic and we understand it. And material, it has to be in our hands. It's just not just what we think. Evidence against the defendant, or in this case, against history itself, right? So that's what we're working with. We want to take our historical text that Indiana Jones came up with out of the jungle, and we want to say, okay, here's our methods for determining this. And as we go through these different series of tests, do we have a majority of evidence that says, yes, in fact, Dr. Jones, this scroll that you got out of this cave in this jungle somewhere in the world is indeed accurate? Or do we not have enough evidence and we have to say, sorry, Dr. Jones, it appears to be fraudulent? So that's what we're working with. So let's go ahead and let's jump into this. how to determine the accuracy of all historical documents. Remember, all historical documents, not just looking at the Bible itself. You may kind of be familiar with the scene in the background of this particular slide. It says, "Welcome, Harvard freshmen." For those of you that are unaware, Harvard University is a fairly well-recognized university around the world, right? And so the process we're going to talk about in this particular presentation is the same one that we would find at any well-respected public university or private university in the world. So this process is based on three things. Secular, which means it's not Sunday school hocus pocus. It means that it is actually something that's used in the real world at non-Christian universities and research institutes and all those things. So it's based on secular. Scientific, we talked about that, right? We have a hypothesis. We go through several tests, and those test results determine whether our hypothesis was correct or incorrect. So secular, scientific, and historical methods. That means it's something that's been used over and over and over again because it's been deemed accurate, right? So the process that we're talking about today is secular, it's scientific, and it's based in historical methods. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into this. So the first test that happens when Indiana Jones brings that scroll out of the jungle and unfurls it onto a desk in front of professors of various backgrounds and departments is they want to know who the author was. Who wrote this document? And largely because if we know who the author of that document is, we can often compare that to other works of the author. And so when we look at this first test is knowing the author who wrote that original document equals greater accuracy. If we find something that's written by a Greek philosopher, let's take Plato as an example, and this scroll says that it was written by Plato, we know we have a bunch of other of Plato's works, so we can compare them. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, because we know Plato as a historical figure who can be trusted with his record of history, but also, even if it's signed like, "Love Plato," and we compare it to other Plato works, if it doesn't seem to match up as far as the vibe and the language, everything else, then we could probably say like, we're not sure this is actually Plato who wrote this. So test one is determining who wrote the document. When we know the author, that automatically means greater accuracy. So that's our first bit of evidence we're collecting in test one. So if it passes that, or however it passes that, we go on to test two, which looks very much like this. Well, what's the date of the writing? When was the original document composed? Now, there's a number of ways we can determine this, right? We could maybe get lucky and find something on that document or that photograph or whatever that historical evidence is that has an actual date on there. If we don't have that, then we may have to rely on something like carbon dating or dating the type of papyrus or paper that was written on or the type of ink used. It could also be according to what historical events are being discussed within the writing, right? If we have a document that is dated 1850, but it's talking about the World Trade Center attack in 2001, we know there's something kind of wonky there, right? So as the previous test was knowing the author equals greater accuracy, in this case, test number two, knowing the dates equals greater accuracy. If we can lock it into that specific time frame, or even more specific, like that particular event on that date, that's going to help us collect more evidence to hopefully prove that this document is indeed accurate. So test one, knowing the author. Test two, knowing the date of the writing, and knowing those dates equals greater accuracy. The next test we move along to is that earliest copy. So we've got the original writing, and then we've got the earliest copy, right? And we have to like kind of take our 21st century lens off of things, right? Right now, we can cut, copy, and paste or copy and paste from any document or any website really quickly, and it takes almost zero effort, right? But we have to understand that prior to the printing press and mass distribution, copying a document was a really big deal. And even more so, copying it accurately was a really big deal. So when we look at making copies or having copies of historical documents, one of the first things we want to look for is the earliest copy to the original date, right? So if something happened in, let's say, year AD 100, We want something that's as close to that date as possible as far as the earliest copy made, right? Because when we're closer to that, there's more of a likelihood of it being accurate. So similar to before, earlier copies equals greater accuracy. Earlier copies, greater accuracy. So we've got our author test. We've got our scientific method test. And then we're also looking at the date test. And now we're looking at the earliest copy. Earliest copies equal greater accuracy. So that's our third test. Our fourth test is very similar, that time span. What's the gap between the actual event and the first document written? So let's say that something goes down in the year AD 100. Let's say someone doesn't write about it and record it until AD 125. So that time span is 25 years from the actual date of the event and the original authorship. Now, I don't know about you, but typically the further I get away from things, the more fuzzy my memory gets, right? So I can remember what I had for breakfast this morning. I cannot remember what I had for breakfast on this date 25 years ago. Just isn't going to happen, right? I probably couldn't even get close, to be really honest with you. So this time span, this fourth test, the gap between the event and the authorship, shorter time span between the actual historical event and the first time it's written about equals greater accuracy. And that should be fairly obvious to us, right? Just kind of like my breakfast example. When we are closer to the actual historical event, when that first copy is made, when the original copy is written, it's much more likely to be accurate than if it becomes a 25-year gap, a 50-year gap, a 100-year gap. We want that gap between the original event and the first writing to be very, very small. Shorter time span, greater accuracy. So that's test number 4. Test number 5, number of copies, right? And I touched on this a little bit earlier. Making copies prior to like 1965 or so was very different than how we do it today. Remember, especially when we're talking about historical texts, we go back to the days of the Roman Empire, or even before. It was a very select people who were educated enough to read and write. Like, we kind of take it for granted today. I hope you agree with that we are a very educated culture and educated world today as compared to previous millennia. So first off, it meant that the number of copies had to be composed by a very select number of people who had the education to be able to read the original and then write the copies of it. The other part about this is we want to understand how many copies are made. Remember, like today, we can go to our printer. If I wanted to print out this slideshow copies on paper, I could hit on my Mac Command P, and then it's going to ask me, hey, how many copies do you want? Well, that's great and convenient for us today, but number of copies, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, were very different, right? We had to take those educated people and they had to sit down in a room and they had to start at the beginning and begin writing out. And oftentimes, right, because we don't have backspace, we don't have whiteout, if there was a mistake made, depending on what the mistake was, sometimes it could be crossed out if it was a little thing, but a lot of times they would have to start over. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine having your job to be to copy something and you almost get done copying it by hand and then you make a mistake and you have to start the entire thing over because it has to be accurate? That's crazy from our perspective. But from our perspective of collecting these documents that are of potential historical value, the number of copies that we have equals greater accuracy, right? So the more copies that are floating around out there, the greater the chances are that this thing that Indiana Jones has pulled out of the jungle is actually accurate, which ties in nicely to test number 6, which is the consistency. Do those copies, if we were to take all the copies that we have found over the years and we put them on a table next to each other, do they all say the same thing? If they aren't all exactly the same thing, what are the differences? Are there differences that are just like, oh, they said it was 500 people gathered instead of 520 people gathered, right? Or it was like, oh, it happened on AD 100 or, oh, AD 101. Like some of those we can go like, okay, like there's small variances. We would expect some of that perhaps, especially because this is how copies were made by hand. But when we look at the greater bit of evidence, the more consistency that we can find between all of those copies out there equals greater accuracy, right? More copies, more consistency, greater accuracy. So we've got our 6 tests there, and we run every document that Indiana Jones pulls out of a cave from a jungle through these 6 tests. And remember, scientific method, historical method, secular method, right? So we've got all this evidence, and we have to now weigh it. We now become the judge and the jury. Based on the 6 secular scientific tests through this historic process, how does that document that we found or that Indiana Jones found, how does it fare? How does it compare to other documents or other artifacts that we know to be bona fide, accurate, authentic? Remember, we want to go back to that courtroom, and we're looking for a preponderance of the evidence. We want to look at it and go, okay, we either have enough evidence or we don't yet have enough evidence, or the evidence that we do have is causing us to be a little bit shaky. It's not really proving our point. So we're looking for that preponderance of an evidence. And then we have to decide, do we accept it? We're deeming that this document or this artifact, this picture, whatever it is authentic. Do we reject it? Does the evidence not line up? Or do we say like, we think it's accurate, it's so close, but we need to wait because we need to gather some more evidence about stuff. So that's now the job of these brilliant professors and historians and sociologists and all these other academic folks to take this evidence and decide one of these 3 fates of this document. We're either going to accept it, yes, it's authentic. We're going to reject it, no, it doesn't line up with anything else that we have, or we think it's close. We need a little bit more evidence though, right? We need to kind of just push pause on that. So that's the job that's happening with those historians with the evidence that they have before them. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if you weren't altogether familiar with these pictures. My students in class actually like, oh, is that your senior picture, Mr. Kleffer? Ha ha. No, it's not. You may remember some of their names though. You probably have at least heard names like Plato and Aristotle, Thucydides, and Caesar, Greek or Roman philosophers and historians. You might even remember this guy who actually is not at all based on the cartoon The Simpsons, but the work of Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's not questioned whether he was accurate or not when it comes to the historical recordings. Now this is important because where we're going from here is really going to take the historical evidence of what we're looking at right now. And then remember, we're going to take the Bible and we're going to put it through the same process as all these other texts. The work of Homer, if we were to go to any noteworthy university on the planet and we go into their history department or their sociology department and say, hey, I don't think that the writings of Homer are accurate. You would be probably, after you were laughed at for a long while by the resident historians at that university, they would call security and have you removed for such slanderous and obscure behavior. The work of Homer is not questioned for its accuracy. That's super important, right? Because we're gonna see when it comes to Homer's works how much evidence is collected about Homer, yet we don't doubt him. So let's go forward a little bit, and we've got this matrix for you. Now, on the top there in the white font, you can kind of see some of those tests, right? The author, the date written, the earliest copy, that time span, the number of copies, and then some type of calculation for the overall accuracy based on the evidence. So we've got Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and Homer there on the left part of the screen. And you can see, looking at Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides, those first 3 there, we've got a pretty good idea, the dates written, when those earliest copies were made. Now, check out, though, that time span, though. We've got 1,300 years, 1,400 years, 1,300 years. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty big gap in that time span there. And remember, one of the things we want to do, we want to have that time span as short or as small as possible. Now, here's the other thing. Look at the number of copies that are listed there for Plato, Aristotle, and Thucydides. 7 copies, 5 copies, 8 copies. Remember, we don't doubt the writings and the accuracy of the works of these 3 men. We have this large time span. We have a small number of copies, and yet we don't doubt the accuracy of their texts. Now, here's what's interesting, though. If we were trying to like calculate the accuracy, going back to intellectual humility, we really can't, right? Because we've got some things missing. Either we have a very few number of copies, or that time span is such a large gap that we can say, okay, we trust these guys, but at the same time, we need to have a little bit of honesty and go like, and at the same time, we wish we had some more evidence. But now look at Homer. If we look at Homer's numbers that are on the screen there, something kind of interesting happens. We have the author, we have the dates written. That time span, it shrinks dramatically. We go from 1,300 years down to 100 years, and in the big scope of history, that's a huge leap. All right, and then something magical also happens. The number of copies available. We go from 7, 5, 8 copies to 14,000 copies. Well, that's something very different. We not only understand who wrote it, the date it was written, the earliest copies, that time span is very small comparatively. The number of copies is overwhelming compared to the others. And so we actually have enough evidence to somewhat calculate, to the best we can, the potential for accuracy. And so based on Homer's evidence, as is listed here, we see that the potential for accuracy is about as accurate as it can possibly be. That other 0.5 are those small nuances where maybe some of the copies had a little fact or something different than the other copies. Can you start to see why Homer is so trusted? So let's go ahead and take the next step then. Let's throw the Bible in there. Remember, that was one of the things that we wanted to do from the get-go on this. We wanted to take the Bible and we wanted to run it through scientific method. We wanted to run it through a historical method. And we wanted to run it through a secular method, something that wasn't Sunday school magic hocus pocus, right? So let's look at those numbers. Now, if we're looking at the Greek manuscripts, we have an idea of when it's written, but we've got to look at this, though. Earliest copies, ? We don't know the earliest copies, so it's really hard for us to figure out a time span. And then the number of copies, like the number of copies is awesome, 643. I mean, especially if we're comparing that to Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides. But the fact is, when we look at all of our evidence for this, earliest copy, time span, accuracy, it's really hard to calculate that accuracy number because of the lack of evidence. Now, a couple of things may be happening when you see this. If you identify as a Christian, you might be thinking, like what do I do with this? And if you identify as someone who's not a Christian and you're going through this course, then you might be saying like, yes, like I get this. And so we have to look at this with this data. Can we say with certainty that the Bible is accurate? Can we take the data that's on the screen right now and look at it and say, running it through the secular method, the scientific method, and the historical method, that the Bible is accurate? I gave you that minute of silence for you to have a little bit of intellectual humility, right? If you identify as Christian and you're seeing these numbers on the screen, intellectual humility for you might say like, it's really hard for me to say that, like to be intellectually humble and have some integrity about me based on these numbers, based on these processes. I can't say that it's accurate. And for those of you who don't identify as Christian and might really be rooted in science and data, you might say, oh, this is great. Like, of course, like if we're going to be intellectually humble, then let's look at the numbers then, right? And this is what the numbers are. And so this is where we sometimes are challenged with our own views. Now, and this is really important for either group, wherever you self-identify. If you identify as a Christian, or if you identify as a non-Christian, someone who believes in hard science and facts and math, what I'm about to go through next is really kind of the crux of this entire lesson. And here it is. The numbers that you see there on the screen are actually a little different. I flip-flop Homer and the New Testament. Yeah, so this is where typically in class with my students, minds are kind of blown. Because at the school that I work at, we have students who identify as Christian and that's all they've ever known. We have students that are like ardent scientists and don't want anything to do with Christ and Christianity. And that's the position that they're going to hold. And then we go through this, and there's the buildup, and then the switching here that actually reveals the actual numbers. All I did was I took the Bible's numbers and I said those were Homer's, and I took Homer's numbers and said those were the Bible's to try to prove, hey, let's get to where we need to get to with this intellectual integrity thing, and then actually revealing the accurate actual numbers, which you see on your screen now. Folks, let me go back again and tell you that we can go to any university on this planet and walk into their history department and say, is the writing of Homer accepted as an accurate understanding of history? And every single university that is of quality and name recognition will say, yes, our understanding of history as written by Homer is accepted as accurate. But I want you to look at this, and I want you to pay attention to this because this is important, right? There's so much about Homer's writings that we don't have. We're not sure about those earliest copies. We're not sure about that time span. And even though we have a good number of copies, and we know that Homer was a historical person, and we know when the date was written of the original document, it's still hard for us to actually come up with an accurate answer. Looking at a preponderance of evidence, we're kind of really on that cusp of going, we want to say, we want to trust. In fact, we have said that we do trust Homer, right? But then I want you to look at that bottom line there that's in white. And those Greek manuscripts, the New Testament, the Bible. We know when it was written. We know when the earliest copy was. That time span, it's actually give or take a little bit of that, right? It's actually probably a little less than that. It's more around 70 years, but we'll say it's up to 100 years, depending on which actual letter or book we're talking about. The number of copies we have of Greek or Aramaic transcripts is off the charts. Off the charts. I mean, look at 14,000 compared to 643, compared to 8, compared to 7, compared to 5. So we have enough evidence before us to say we can actually form some type of calculation here because we have put the Bible through secular, not Sunday school hocus pocus, scientific hypothesize, test, come up with our answer. And historic, we've done this. This is our method. It's been working for us. It is the method that we use to determine all documents. And we can come out this, and if again, going back to the court case, we would have to say with this data, we can say with certainty the Bible is accurate. And now, here's really where you have to go from here. If you identify as a Christian, but maybe didn't see faith and science coming together, you saw them as two separate silos, you have to take this. You have to take this and you have to go like, oh no, science has just showed how we can take those Greek New Testament manuscripts and we can rest with certainty that it's accurate. That should be a good thing. If you don't identify as Christian and you are an ardent lover of math and science, and by the way, why can't you be both a Christian and love math and science? But if you don't identify as Christian and you've kind of said like, oh, prove it to me, it's just been proven for you. It's just been proven for you, right? If you identify as a non-Christian, you have to have intellectual humility about you to say, maybe I need to learn more. Maybe there's some more investigating I personally need to do. Maybe the conclusions I've come to thus far need to be revisited. This doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're wrong or anything like that. What it means is you've been given this evidence like a judge or a jury would. You've been given this evidence, and now you have the fun part of trying to figure it out. But I want to go back to the beginning of our chat together. And so particularly if this is kind of blowing your mind right now and you're tempted to kind of disregard intellectual humility, what I don't want you to do is become apathetic. Apathy is such a danger to you and I and the world that we live in, when we just kind of say like, oh, but my conclusions on whatever it is, in this case, the actual scientific accuracy of Scripture, is so rooted and so much a part of my identity that I'd rather just kind of hold to my beliefs than to actually do the hard work to actually maybe unpack some of the things that I think were accurate, because they may not be how I thought they were. This is by far and large one of the favorite things I talk about with my students in class. Not because any of us, especially myself, go like, aha, here you go, but because it really opens up dialogue. It opens up this neat opportunity to go, oh, I need to either A, as a non-Christian, take a look at how I evaluate things, or it's B, like, oh, I'm a Christian, and this, I don't have to just kind of have this loose thing called faith, but now it's actually backed up by science from universities that aren't Christian, and that's kind of cool too. So as we go forward in this course, I want you to be able to wrestle with this. I want you to be able to continue to work on that intellectual humility piece, right? Because that part doesn't stop with this lesson. In all the things that we cover throughout this course, there's going to be some things that challenge your worldview. Some things that you might say like, I don't think that that's right. Or I disagree with that. And good. That's great. And at the same time, I want you to have enough intellectual integrity. I want to have enough intellectual humility where you're actually able to go like, ooh, I hadn't thought about that. Or maybe I need to look at things a little differently. Or I need to investigate things further, right? So that's going to wrap up this particular lesson about thinking biblically. That we can rest in assurance that what Scripture has brought forth to us, we have overwhelming evidence. And the question now becomes, if science and secular methods and historical methods have deemed the contents of the Bible historically accurate, then it's now up for you to wrestle with the contents of the New Testament. It's now up for you to say like, okay, I may need to take another look at this dude named Jesus. And that could be scary. That could push back against some of your closely held worldviews. And that's okay, because Jesus is filled with grace and love, and there's nothing that we can do to make him love us any more or any less. And he, just as I, would invite you into that challenge. Push back, test. Heck, his own disciples push back on whether the resurrection and things were real, right? Like Thomas said, like, let me see the holes in your arm, dude. And he does. And what does he say? Like, touch them, right? Touch them. So if this is new to you, if this is kind of blowing your mind, good. And then be encouraged to take that and go like, I need to explore. I can't be apathetic. I need to have intellectual integrity and intellectual humility, and I need to propel myself forward as a human so that I can come to the conclusion based on the evidence before me of what is accurate and good and true. I'll look forward to connecting with you all on some future installments of podcasts and lessons throughout this course. Thanks for hanging out with me today.